you. Test, test. All right. Nope. I don't usually plan them.
You see how dark it had turned? Mm-hmm.
For a while, and do you have another one?
Oh, you know
yeah.
what that is?
No, I don't.
That's a hickory nut.
Okay.
Now, it wasn't that color, but you carry stuff around with your change and feel of it.
Yeah.
Feel how smooth it was.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's
That's
kinda
pretty
like
too, like polished.
together.
Yeah.
You need to plant that buckeye.
Mm-hmm. All right. See what happens.
Somewhere where you know, it grows
Get to
a
watch
bush. It doesn't grow a tree.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you. I have a handout that I gave out last week. Does anyone need one? Did not get one. So last week, for those of you who are new today, we started a lesson on 1 Samuel. Also said 2 Samuel, but I have my doubts even after the first week that we're going to get very far all the way to 2 Samuel in about 16 weeks. So this is more of, this handout is just more of a, yeah, you too. More of an overview of the context of Samuel. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. And kind of gives you some, your bearings. I'm going to shut these doors real quick. kind of gives you your bearings. And Samuel, if you're like me, then you do pretty well to know where Genesis is and what Genesis is about. And then the farther you get into the Old Testament, the more you may lose your way a little bit, less familiar with some of the books and how they relate to one another. So this is compiled from different commentaries and such. But the Jewish Bible, as the Jews would divide their scriptures, Tanakh, this acronym of Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim, from the law, the prophets, and the writings. So they have three primary categories, whereas Christians have 4 or 5 sometimes, between the Pentateuch, historical, poetic, and the prophets. In the biblical narrative, you see it moving from creation to new creation through the fall in Israel and Christ's coming, of course, and then Act 5, which is where we are today after the resurrection and ascension, the church and new creation. So we're somewhere in number 3 in Samuel, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and then you see some of the dates there of some of the key figures, Saul and David in 1st and 2nd Samuel. So, but looking down at the bottom of the page, some of the content of the book, within the book, you've got 3 parts, different ways to divide 1st and 2nd Samuel into different parts. One of those is into 1st and 2nd Samuel. Originally, the book is one book. It's Samuel, right? And it's put into, with the Greek translation and kind of Christian history, maybe scroll length and different reasons for breaking the book in 2. But 1st and 2nd Samuel was written as a whole. And so the division there is somewhat arbitrary. We ought to think about it all together, 1st and 2nd Samuel. But you see 3 different primary parts. First, chapter 1 to 7, with the rule of the house of Eli, which we'll be back in just a moment. And then King Saul comes onto the scene officially, chapter 8 to 31. And then David dominates, his reign dominates 2nd Samuel. Then the questions again, to reiterate as we get started. As we're reading this text, which this class, I am attempting to just simply read the text with us as a class. This is, when I was growing up, a lot of the Bible classes were verse by verse, pick a book, read the verse, talk about the verse, read the next verse, talk about it, read the next verse, talk about it. And I don't know that I've ever really taught a class like that for different reasons, but this class I'm trying to teach more along those lines of we're just going to read the text and talk about that together and see what we see. But I think there are some strategies for reading or questions that we might ask as we read this. And one is just to think some about what does the narrator, that is whoever is writing this and telling this story, which maybe some people thought it was Samuel at one point, which is why his name is on it, but probably couldn't be Samuel because he dies pretty early in the story. So I don't know that he could be responsible for all of it unless the Lord's inspiration works in some mysterious ways. And he wrote it before I don't think that happened. But anyway, so Samuel, though, we read this and ask the question, what does the narrator say? What does the narrator not say? And this is part of, for me, what makes these stories so fascinating is the detail they give and the detail that they don't give. And so part of that is for me to urge us not to be too hasty in coming to conclusions about, what's happening and what's not happening, but to really just hear what is actually said in the text and what's not said. Allow ourselves to ask questions about what's there and what's not there, to imagine some possibilities, just to choose some things over. So I think sometimes we jump to conclusions too soon, and we're meant to engage the text a little more deeply. Another question is how is the monarchy viewed? We'll see that in coming chapters, but typically we think of they asked for a king, so the Lord gave them a king, and it was just a bad thing from the start. But it's a little bit more of a complicated picture than that. You see a tension, and we'll see this today, between a holy God and an unholy people. And how does the Lord use us as humans, right? How does the Lord work with people like Eli and his sons, who are supposed to be priests, to accomplish his will, and even people, the hero of Samuel, David, as great as he was not without his own flaws. So how does God use people like that? How does God use people like us? So what's the relationship and dynamic there between those things? And then finally, the question that we ask as Christian folks of all texts is, where do we see Christ in this? How do these point us to Jesus? Whether in a kind of what's missing, what is needed, or even some ways that we hear echoes of the gospel, even in these old stories. Did y'all get one of these? Yes, okay. Sorry, didn't mean to put you on the spot. Anybody else need one? They're up here if you do. I can give you one after. And I even have another handout if we get to it, which I'm not sure that we will. But go ahead. Take as many of those as you want. So we're in 1 Samuel. In my Bible, it's on page 266. I don't know if that helps anybody. But if you're using this exact Bible, it's on page 266. So 1 Samuel. One of the things that I did put on that handout that I meant to mention, that I just forgot to mention, was Samuel. We see the transition from Israel as ruled by judges and kind of the tribe, ruled by tribe and division by tribe, to a monarchical state. So where you have a king, Saul, and then David. And so that's part of, this is ground zero the right word? I don't know how that term gets used sometimes, but this is like the place where this is happening, is in Samuel, where that transition is being made from rule by judges to rule by kings. And so this is the on-ramp into that. Last week we talked about 1 Samuel chapter 1, 1 to 8. And just to recap that briefly, there was a man who had two wives. Do y'all remember the name of the man? Elkanah. And I don't know that there's a right way to pronounce these. If my friend Lance Hawley, who teaches Old Testament, were here, he could tell you exactly how to say these words. But since I don't do that, I don't know for sure. I just make up the sound, the pronunciation that sounds right, and you say it confidently, and then you just let the chips fall where they may. So Elkanah or Elkanah. The man had two wives. The two wives were Peninnah and Hannah. And one of them could have children, one of them could not. Peninnah had children. Hannah had no children. So this is the conflict that we are introduced to. And they went up year by year to the temple there in Shiloh, where the temple was at that point. I was reading about this. Obviously, the temple's not in Shiloh. So what kind of structure would this have been? Scholars don't know whether it's like a tent, or maybe there was some kind of actual stone building or something more permanent. But you do have the word temple here that's used, house or temple, which is kind of strange because this is before the temple is constructed. So that's another thing that gets us thinking, what is that, how is that word used? And that's an interesting term to use, especially if it's just a tent still. So they go up as a family, Elkanah and his wives, year by year. And Hannah is weeping, and Elkanah says to her in verse 8, this famous line, "Why do you weep? Why do you not eat? Why is your heart sad? Am I not more to you than 10 sons?" Which I think we talked about last week, whether that was a wise thing to say or not. Don, what did you think?
Well, I think she probably didn't hear that.
Would not have been helpful.
Boy.
Right. She wanted a boy, and she didn't need to hear that. That was his attempt to help and say something right. I think someone said, though, last week that it seemed to have worked because after that, it seems like she ate, right? Or maybe she was feeling somewhat better. I don't know. So whether that was the right thing to say or not, for me, it does strike me wrong as, better to not say that than to try to console your wife who just wants a son, right? Wants a child. Yeah, depends on that context. That's right. Yeah, and so much here is there are two ways or more that you could take things. So, all right, let's start with verse 9, and we'll read this and talk about it together and go from there. I was hoping we'd get into chapter 2, but I'm sure that's not going to happen today. All right, verse 9. After they had eaten and drunk in Shiloh, Hannah rose. Now Eli the priest was sitting on the seat beside the doorpost of the temple of the Lord. She was deeply distressed and prayed to the Lord and wept bitterly. She vowed a vow and said, O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your servant, remember me and not forget your servant, but will give to your servant a son, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and no razor shall touch his head. And as she continued praying before the Lord, Eli observed her mouth. Hannah was speaking in her heart, only her lips moved, and her voice was not heard. And then Eli took her to be a drunken woman. And Eli said to her, how long will you go on being drunk? This is kind of hilarious, I think. Comic relief here already in this tragic comic relief here in verse 14. Put your wine away from you. But Hannah answered, no, my Lord, I am a woman troubled in spirit. I have drunk neither wine nor strong drink, but I have been pouring out my soul before the Lord. Do not regard your servant as a worthless woman, for all along I have been speaking out of my great anxiety and vexation. And then Eli answered, go in peace, and the God of Israel grant you your petition that you have made to him. And she said, let your servant find favor in your eyes. And then the woman went away and ate, and her face was no longer sad. Verse 19, they rose early in the morning to worship before the Lord, and they went back to their house at Ramah. And Elkanah knew Hannah, his wife, and the Lord remembered her. And in due time Hannah conceived and bore a son. And she called his name Samuel, for she said, I have asked for him from the Lord. All right, so we'll go back and pick this back up in verse 9 and walk back through it. So you see the prayer that she makes there before Eli. Eli's blessing. They go home. They have relations, so to speak. And then Hannah bears Samuel, her son. So in verse 9, they'd eaten and drunk in Shiloh. Hannah rose. Eli the priest sitting at the seat beside the doorpost of the temple of the Lord. So in the ancient world, apparently, sitting in chairs was like a sign of power and authority. Like it wasn't very always typical to have chairs that you would be sitting in. So this is a symbol of his role as a priest, to be sitting there beside the doorpost of the temple. I guess if there's a doorpost of the temple, there's got to be some kind of permanent structure, right? It can't just be a tent. So maybe there's a combination of some kind of permanent structure with a tent, or maybe it's just the permanent structure. I'm not really sure. She's deeply distressed. She prays to the Lord and wept bitterly. How many times can you say it, right? In verse 10, deeply distressed and praying to the Lord and weeping bitterly, and she vows a vow to the Lord. Does this vow that she makes remind you of a vow that we read about in Scripture? The Nazarite vow, that's right, in Numbers chapter 6 that you could read about there. Now, not for certain that it is the Nazarite vow, that it matches perfectly, but it is a vow kind of like that. And what is Hannah essentially saying when she asks this child of the Lord? What's she promising to do with the child? What is it? Give him back. Yeah, give him back. Give him back and give him wholly to the Lord. Which is, isn't that kind of strange? If Hannah wants a son that bad, and a little bit later, we read at the end of this chapter that she's going to kind of drop him off like a boarding school kind of situation after he's weaned, which was, maybe around 3 years old. We're not really sure how old, but I mean, not like a 6-month-old kid. But you would think if you prayed for, you didn't have a child, you didn't have a son, and you prayed for one, that you would want to keep that kid, right? You would want to know that kid, to raise that child. And so somehow Santa prays and says, if you give me a son, I will give him back to you. And after just a few years, I mean, I don't know what that tells us about Hannah, but incredible faith, right?
Couldn't part of that be that
Yeah.
it shut the other wife up from
Yeah.
giving her grief?
Yeah, maybe so. So maybe Hannah doesn't necessarily love her child.
Son, don't be
Yeah. So it evens the score some. But that's right. I mean, it does. We talked about this some last week, how modern sensibility, we're a little offended by how pragmatic some of these relationships could be in the Old Testament about burying a child. And we want to emphasize romantic love and connection between spouses. And a lot of it, there's cultural expectation of, no, a wife was meant to bear children. And if you couldn't, then something was broken, something wasn't right. And so the kind of shame or distress that she was in, especially being how Elkanah had a wife that was bearing children and she wasn't able to, just made her situation even worse. Yes, sir.
It made me think of Ephesians 5:18. Be not drunk with wine where it's excess, but be filled with the Spirit. And that's a pretty picture of sort of what that looks like.
Yes, okay. And how does it connect to this?
She wasn't drunk with
That's,
wine.
yeah.
She was focused on the Spirit.
That's right. Well, and I thought of Acts 2, where Peter says these men are not drunk. It's only 9 a.m, and so you have this now. And the ironic thing here, and this is kind of a shame for me being a minister here, because I'm throwing shade on folks like myself, I guess, is that you have a minister, you have a priest who has this woman in his company who is just absolutely sincere in her faith and praying to God in the house of the Lord. and he sees her, and his first thought is, she's intoxicated. What does that say about Eli? Not good things. Or what does it say about kind of the broken systems of that day, or like his typical parishioners, right? I mean, his church, the people that frequented the temple there at Shiloh. I mean, how many drunk people did he see on a week, right? That came in and prayed and thought, man, here's another one here. And no, but actually Hannah is sincere, and she's praying, and he misses it.
He get on to her, but he didn't get on to his own sons.
Yeah, right.
And they were doing worse.
Now you're meddling with with us, especially with me, with my young boys who yeah, that's right. So you've got Hophni and Phinehas who are really well, the text says worthless. This is in chapter 2 now, and verse 12, which we'll come to probably in about 3 months when we get down there. But yeah, they're worthless, and they are. They fail to see the significance of what they're doing, and to have any reverence for their job, their work. They are taking advantage of people and the sacrificial system, right? So yeah, and failing to tend to his own household. So there's a lot of tragedy there with Eli, and it is interesting that you have the priest who's supposed to be the one who has eyes to see. And if there's anybody who is, able to see and appreciate faith, it should be the priest of the Lord. And yet it's him who looks at Hannah and thinks that she's intoxicated. There's probably a kind of a bus stop there for us this morning with those of us who frequent church, especially those of us in leadership in church. those of us who deal with people a lot, which is maybe everybody in this room, is it tempting for us to kind of assume the worst about people, right? As you deal with people who have needs or are headaches or have complaints. I know the elders wouldn't know anything about that. People with complaints or suggestions for improvement or that kind of thing. But to just start to assume kind of the worst to get cynical in what we do and to fail to see how God is working in people. And it's interesting that just because I or an elder or somebody holds a post of an official leader like Eli does not mean that, and y'all know this, it doesn't mean that we're closer to the Lord, right? It could be some person who comes into church quiet, doesn't make a peep, sitting, on the back row, not to, my mom or Eva, not to call y'all out back there on the back row, but who knows the Lord better than anybody else in the room, and in the Lord's church, right? That's how things might work. So Hannah actually has to defend herself. Now, to Eli's credit, he's seems fairly incompetent, and it is comic relief of sorts that he's sitting there thinking that she's a drunken woman. He does recover, right? You see that some where she comes back and corrects him. No, this is in verse 15. No, I am a woman troubled in spirit. I've not drunk wine or strong drink. I've been pouring out my soul before the Lord. The interesting connection between drinking wine and strong drink and pouring yourself out before the Lord. Do not regard your servant as a worthless woman. I need to check to see if that's the same worthless that's used down in verse 12 of chapter 2. I wonder if it is. That connection. I am not worthless, but his own sons were worthless. That goes to your point there. I'm not a worthless woman. All along I've been speaking out of great anxiety and vexation. And then in verse 17, Eli recovers, and he ends up blessing her and saying, may the Lord grant your petition. One of my questions about that is, do you think that Eli blessing her and saying these words, go in peace and the God of Israel grant your petition that I have made to him, do you think that did anything? Like, do you think that, now God is going to do a miracle in giving them a child, we just read, and just the next paragraph here, but do you think the priest's blessing of her and her prayer was the switch that was flipped that allowed God to, I say allowed God might not be the right language, but that was kind of where the breakthrough occurred, was the priestly blessing there at Shiloh? Or do you think it had nothing to do with that and it was God was going to do what God was going to do anyway? Carol, what do you think?
I think it had something to do with her.
Okay.
I think it gave her a feedback that she considered from God, and she thought it meant something.
Okay.
It had something to do with it.
Yeah.
Whether it actually did or not.
Okay, that's a good answer. It had she hearing that word from a priest, it blessed her in some way. And it's interesting that Hannah comes to this temple year after year, and this is this chronic ailment that she had, this experience of suffering and praying and asking and nothing happening, but she keeps coming back. And even with Eli being incompetent and this sort of almost buffoon of a character of a priest, it seems like she still treats him well with reverence and respect as a priest. I get that in the text. It seems like that's communicated, that even though that's surely a frustrating experience of, can't you see I'm pouring out my heart to the Lord, she doesn't dismiss him and his position, right? And so she receives this word, and it does seem to have some kind of positive effect on her, that the priest of the Lord has spoken. Even if the priest of the Lord is not who the priest of the Lord ought to be, he still has some power or authority. Yeah, yes?
I think it shows that God still works through men who flaw his system. So, we're not reliant upon the preacher or the priest for our relationship with God. And so just because he and his family's messing things up doesn't mean that God still can't do good things through people.
Good. So kind of a both and. God is working, kind of despite leadership. Whatever the leadership's doing, doesn't mean God can't work at a place or at a location or in the temple or with the people. But also God can still use those people who are flawed to work through them. Yeah, Mark, and then maybe I see David's hand too. Yeah.
The Coast Guard, and so at the end of the day, you have that peace and that calmness that she is no longer sad. And I think that reminded her of the faithfulness of God.
Yeah, that God was listening. Yeah, David.
Yeah, I think it kind of, that Hannah actually blesses Eli because it wakes him up to the failure that he didn't do with his sons. And he sees someone that will dedicate
Yeah.
that son to the Lord.
Yeah.
When you look at Ephesians, the 6th chapter, verse 4, it says, fathers, don't provoke your children to wrath, but bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. I think that's a call that we all should have, Hannah's call, that we should dedicate our children and pray that they grow up.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's the greatest blessing I think our parents could ever have.
Amen. Well, and some of this reminds me of, do we see church as, we're here at church going through the motions, another Sunday, just another group of people with, this, but with a different topic. We're talking about the Bible or whatever. And I think it's possible for some of us to see even worship as this very common, mundane thing. And we see in this story, as you said, Hannah blessing Eli, that, no, God is actually at work here. And even if we fail to see it and we kind of get lulled into, just church again, it's just church, it's just another worship service. No, actually, God is working. So, yeah, Don, do you have something?
It strikes me kind of funny. Hannah, who is dedicated to God and dedicates her child to God, sends him to Eli as a young child to be raised.
Right.
And he's been such a failure with his own two boys. I see a little, but he seems to have done a really good job with Samuel. I think on in the chapter where he talks about the God calling to Samuel, he says, well, if he says something to you, just say, here, my Lord, I'll send you.
But how many times does it take him to get there?
Yeah.
3 times, right? So, Eli still has some growth to do. But Don, that's a great point. Hannah drops her child off with this guy, Eli, who has not done well with his own children, apparently. And I don't want to deny Hophni and Phinehas's agency either, right? Maybe he was the perfect dad, and they turned out, terribly wrong. I don't know what the story is. That's right. God did hold him accountable later. You might need to teach this class, Don, if you got. Does that seem like parental neglect to y'all? Here it is, Mother's Day, and Hannah prays for this child. God grants. She has vowed a vow, and I don't know. It seems like that vow was. I guess it is somewhat public because Elkanah knows about it, or she tells him about it. I haven't actually read that part. But sticks with her vow. She doesn't try to kind of go back on it and say, now I've got this child and I'm rethinking this, especially when, this interaction with Eli did not seem to go so well. I mean, how many interactions do you need with somebody before you get this like sense of, you ever interacted with someone and thought, I would never let them babysit my kids? Maybe that's not your first thought, but you just, if babysitters come to mind and you're like, oh yeah, this person, no, not them. They're not going to be, I'm just not sure. There's something about them. This is not just babysitting that she's asking Eli to do, but raise her son. So what do you think about that? Is it neglect? Is it, maybe, was it I got this other, Penina off my back because I had a child and I'm good and this is the best of both worlds. I have a kid, but I don't have to do anything to raise him after 2 or 3 years. I don't get that impression of Hannah. Hannah's usually, a good person in the way we tell these stories, not kind of self-seeking. Go ahead.
Nancy said that she dedicated her son to God, not to the priest.
Right.
And God had a system in place. She put her son under God's system, under God's umbrella, trusting him that God would make sure Samuel ended up where he did.
Was okay. Yeah, good. Yeah, dedication to God, not to the priest. Yes, sir.
Also interested, how is in Exodus 13, God commanded Moses, command the Israelites, firstborn Israelite was to be dedicated to him, even of the animals that they had.
Yeah.
So Hannah looks like she was
Following to that.
what had already been commanded.
Right. And to an extreme, though, to take him to this seems to be atypical that, it wasn't like Eli's running a boarding school or an orphanage or something here where he's got all these kids underfoot. But no, this is something special that Hannah has decided to do.
Hannah's defense, though, isn't it quite an achievement for him to say, that's not my son. I've got a full-time job trying to oversee this. I got 2 kids that won't behave anyway. Mm-hmm. It took a lot for Eli to accept Samuel and the responsibility of raising him
That's
under
good.
God's tutelage, I think.
That's good. Yeah.
You don't think she dropped completely out of the picture?
Right. No, yeah, she's somewhere there in the background, and surely, yeah. Yeah, that's one of those things the text doesn't tell us a lot about. But
When Jesus was born, get this story straight, put him in that basket. Now that's Moses.
right.
She didn't drop completely out of sight.
Yeah. And the Lord kind of brought that back to her, right? Moses' mom, to raise her own kid with permission. Desperate times, desperate measures to put your kid in a basket and float him down the river. One of the things that I observe in this story is just how God is always doing something new. And God is always working. And we've talked about some of the newness in Samuel between the judges and the kings, and that transition that's taking place here in this story. But also you think of Eli and his own sons, and kind of the ways that they lost sight of the sacredness of what they were doing, it seems. And yet God does not just kind of say, well, I'm a hostage to, Eli and his sons and their sons forever and ever. But no, actually the story is going to pick up not with Eli and this person who's, the ruling of over Shiloh there, but with this, Elkanah and Hannah and their son, who's then inserted into that story, seemingly out of left field. Who would have seen this coming? No, it's the faith of this woman rising from this need and barrenness that's ultimately for the glory of God, who prays, and God answers that prayer with a miracle and the son that's brought into this story. The way that God works in surprising, beautiful ways, that isn't not just one thing after another, but God is inserting into the story his own purposes, is a great reminder to us. Any other comments on that portion before we move on? Yes, sir. Mm-hmm.
And I looked at that and it says a double portion.
Mm-hmm.
Her womb was, the fact that it says that he really loved Hannah.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that definitely seems to signal that he loved her. I was just reading this week because there's a translation that said, I think it's the RSV, that says, even though he loved her, even though she was barren, he only gave her one portion or a single portion. Does any of your Bibles read that way? Down in verse 5, it says double portion or a worthy portion. There's one translation I was reading that said a single portion. So I think the Hebrew term there may be a little debated. What exactly does it mean? Double? Does it mean worthy? It seems to be there's something significant here. Now, Peninnah has family that would have required more of the kind of the leftovers of the sacrifice that they would enjoy and take. But Hannah gets maybe double for an individual, or maybe as much as Peninnah's whole family got. We're not really sure, but it does seem to communicate that Elkanah had kind of loved Hannah. It says that, loved Hannah more. So it's a beautiful tribute to her. Well, this might have been brought up last week too, that you see the ordering in verse 2 of Hannah and then Peninnah. And am I right in thinking, I'm looking at my biblical scholars over here, that you would have gotten married and then perhaps gotten another wife. One, this communicates that Elkanah has some status. He's got some wealth, right? Now, it wasn't always typical for a person to have more than one wife. But people who have some status and have some wealth would. But also perhaps it shows that Hannah was the first wife. Hannah couldn't have children, and so then he takes on the second wife who could bear children. Does that seem to be something to that, the ordering of those names? Does anyone know? Sounds good. All right. So we're speculating that Hannah would have been the first spouse, unable to bear children, and so now we have a second spouse to make up for what Hannah could not do. And so again, that just adds, insult to injury. Where imagine being, the only spouse, and then imagine it'd be one thing if Peninnah had been there, right? And then you're married in, and it's like, well, I knew this all along, that there's more than one of us. It's another thing if, because of some deficiency in what I'm able to do, my husband has to go get another woman to bear children. It just seems like that would make the whole situation as worse as it could be. Yeah, Carol, and then David and Don.
I just want to mention the obvious parallel with Abraham and
Hagar. Yeah. Hagar. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, there's this theme of barrenness and miraculous births, right, that we see in other places in the Old Testament. David?
Me, I'd want a son to carry on the family name.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, David.
Yeah, I think you see that as Carol says about what Sarah finds for Abraham, and it's kind of odd too that Sarah felt after she bare Isaac that there was that contention, as the same contention is here with Samuel, his mother and the other wife.
Yeah. It's almost like, multiple spouses is not a good idea or God's design. Yeah.
Like Sarah thought that she could solve the problem, that it was God that solved the problem. And she thought she could solve
Right.
the problem.
Right.
Maybe with that, but as far as Hannah, I think that the object there was the fact that what gift you give to me, I'll give it back.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. Yes, sir.
Just gonna say, in Deuteronomy 21:15 and 16, 17, it talks about a man having two wives and the blessings that he gives to the beloved, the child of the beloved versus the child of the hated, and the double portion given.
Okay.
Anyway, so it
Good.
sort of gives some law that he
Very
might
good.
be leaning on.
I need to go back and look at that. Deuteronomy 21. Okay. Very good. Thank you. Don?
The tribulation between the two wives, I see it as Hannah was loved. The other one was there to have children. And I see where that would cause conflict, that the wife of the children and I hated her because she was the more loved wife. And then Hannah hated her because she was the one blessed with children, and she had none. And I see where that would really cause a lot of tension within the
Absolutely.
family. Poor old Elkanah,
That's right. Well, thank you all for your engagement today. Just to sum this up, we'll start in chapter 2 next week. But the thing that I'm chewing on as I read chapter 1 is just Hannah's example, which is a pretty incredible example of coming into the Lord's house with this priest who apparently doesn't really know what he's doing, but coming with sincere faith, coming anyway, even though this place and this, year after year is a reminder of all that the Lord has not done for her. And asking anyway, of being granted this child, of God answering her prayer after years and years of her vexation. But then of Hannah following through on her oath, even to hand Samuel back to this priest who's incompetent, but following through on what she said she would do. Hannah's example is just really remarkable and something for us to chew on this week. So thank you all again for your engagement, all the comments and questions and such, and we'll begin in chapter 2 next week. Thanks. Oh, you want one of those? Yes.